Hey guys, my name is Mary-Jo. I'm an Azure technical trainer based in the Netherlands, and I work for our customers all over Europe. So we teach our customers how to use Azure, and I mostly focus on anything data and AI related.
We'll go to kind of our first point, which was, what is responsible AI in Azure machine learning? And if you were saying this to like a 16-year-old in high school and you're trying to explain this to them, how would you define it?
Yeah, so I would think like if you're 16-year-olds, you're probably on the verge of maybe applying for college. At least I had to apply for college and I had to write up my resume and a motivation letter. And nowadays they use more and more systems to actually decide whether you should be admitted. But, before it was more a person that would decide on it. And I would want to know from the people that would decide on my future, why they made a decision. Did they reach a fair decision? Do they not include any bias, but also, let me know why I wasn't selected or why I was. And I think now that we're moving towards AI taking over those kind of decisions, we expect the same things from AI as well. So no bias, transparency, fairness, all the same things we would expect from any person that would make a decision.
Yeah, that's a good example. I feel like I don't think we really had to do that in Canada, at least not where I applied. But I mean, if you're making a decision that's going to impact someone's life, you should definitely be able to explain why you have done that. And I guess kind of for this conversation, we can go more towards like what the tooling looks like in Azure. So I know as part of we have the same role. So I know one of the courses that we both teach is the data science course in Azure, and we focus a lot. I think there's a module all about responsible AI or responsible machine learning. And I feel like it's changed a lot recently. So can you kind of talk about like what's covered in that module and how it's kind of different from the rest of the modules? But yeah, I'll leave it at that. Just about what do we talk about in responsible machine learning?
Yeah, it's actually funny that you put it that way because for me, I find it always like very statistical part of our training. Because I like my background is also more in data analysis. So for me, every time that we talk about, the way that we cluster things or the way that we want to actually see how we reach a certain decision and how different variables are related to each other, that's very much statistics for me. But yeah, so in the responsible AI section, one of the things that we incorporate is that we want to understand, and this is a hard word for me, but interpretability. um, I always
It is a
have
hard
I
word.
always stumble on that word. But
Me
yeah, so
too.
we want to be able to interpret why a model made a certain prediction. Like if we're using a model to predict whether you should be admitted to a college, we want to know what has factored into that decision, how much it factored into that decision, not just in general over our complete, audience, but also just for each individual so that we can also make sure that we can have a transparent and responsible AI. So we can actually tell them, why and if it made sense. Because also a lot of the times, if you do those kind of approaches, you understand that there's some kind of bias in your data or maybe in the model that you've created. So that, if you notice that one of the factors that influence the decision is your gender, then something's up and you should fix your model. So that's one big part of it. And the other one is fairness. So making sure that you're not, again, having some kind of bias. So maybe better predicting diabetes for men over women, or that you're picking up on some kind of problem that you might have in your data or your model. So in general, I think, it has a societal impact, but we're doing it mostly by looking at kind of the statistical measures behind data to understand if it has any trends that we should be aware of that could cause bias or anything like that.
And that's interesting. I guess would it be fair to say that like the idea of responsible AI isn't exactly to tell you what you should be doing or like this is how you should build your model or this is what's right. It's more just like this is what you've built and showing it across those pillars to say like, do you even know that this is how it ranks, and just like giving you that info so that you can then say, yes, that's what we meant to do, or oh, whoops, we didn't actually mean for it to be biased like
Yeah.
that.
Well, I think there's two big sides of responsible AI. I think you have the more societal one where we really have to think about how do we want AI to be integrated into our society. So then how should we work with AI? Should we have some kind of black box AI where we don't really know how a certain decision has come to be? But the other side is just how we can actually then check up on bias or indeed, those kind of things. And that's more the technical side, I would say. And that's more the statistical side, which is what we mostly cover in our course, because of course that's kind of, engineered towards data scientists that then need to act upon it. But before you even, choose to use those tools, you already need to decide on how you want to work with AI and what you will allow and what you won't allow. And for example, what data you're allowed to use if you're using private or privacy sensitive data in some way. So all those things are, I think, more in a discussion with the business and maybe with multiple stakeholders. And the other side is really just understanding, getting a more objective view maybe on your data and understanding what you're working with.
Yeah, it almost makes me wonder with those if people are, I feel like it's really hard to find data that is not biased because inherently like society is biased. So it's like, I feel like it's such a difficult problem to solve. And from a tooling perspective, the most we can provide is, like you said, like these kind of analyses that show what you may have been doing wrong and what you weren't aware of. And it kind of is makes me think about before it was like, can we actually accomplish this? Like people are talking about, oh, what could AI do and what could life look like? But now it's more just like, should we do this? And I think a lot of people are stepping back now to use this kind of tooling to assess whether or not they should be going forward with them. And you mentioned this kind of black box AI. So can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that, and then what some of the trade-offs are of choosing kind of a, oh, I don't want to define it. I'll let you define it, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. So it's been a very interesting topic because before this role, I was advising customers on what kind of tools they should use. So less education, more pre-sales. And there I actually worked a lot with financial institutions in the Netherlands, and we also worked together with the national bank here to kind of understand what is AI and how they should create I would say guidelines, but it's actually like the laws for the financial institutions in the country. And they were struggling with this a lot. So they were also saying, like, if a bank or a insurance company, for example, has a lot of power over someone's life, like you can give someone a mortgage or not, and with that they can buy a house or not. So in their case, they were very, very careful with the data that they allowed those financial institutions to use, and also how they would then use models to reach certain decisions. And they were very adamant against like black box models. So they always said, you have to be able to explain exactly why a certain decision has come to be. If you don't give a mortgage, why is this? Transparency is key. So for example, if they wanted to use a certain set of algorithms known as deep learning, where you can have so many layers that it becomes kind of impossible to really understand how, like there's the decision tree to reach a decision, it becomes so complex that you cannot even interpret it anymore. And they would use that, for example, for text analysis, maybe to detect fraud, which could be very useful. But then again, the kind of overarching in organizations that like we don't allow this, even if maybe in those cases where you can really, really prove it is necessary and there's no other way. But preferably we would go for more simpler models that maybe have less accuracy so that we can still ensure that you can explain it. But at the same time, I've also seen a lot of research groups kind of like playing into that, making sure that even those simpler models can get higher accuracy so that you don't even need to use the complex models, just to make sure that you can be transparent and accountable.
Yeah, it's a good point bringing up like how there's obviously an extremely technical part of this, but then at the end of the day, in a lot of industries, someone's going to have to explain that back. And so if you use something that's super complex just for the sake of the tech, then it makes it a lot more complicated to explain back and actually, show like, this is how our decision is made. Because obviously in previous, where it's just people doing it, you can just ask the person like, hey, how'd you make this decision? But with the computer, you have to go back and be able to explain this is what we were telling it to do, and this is the information it was using, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think I like this new trend because there's so many things that can come out of it. Like, first of all, indeed, you're making sure that people are accountable and understanding what they're doing, and they can't just say like, oh, it's like a system that decided upon it, so we can't do anything about it. But at the same time, I think it also really helps the adoption of using AI for these kind of things, because it does have like a massive, impact. And for example, I talked to a startup here in Amsterdam that used AI to understand whenever there was a tumor in the lungs, and it really helped because lung cancer is one of those diseases that always gets caught way too late. But you have a very clear risk group that you can monitor very easily, and using AI, you can do it even better than doctors could do. Like they proved it over and over again. But their problem was also that they couldn't get doctors on their side. They didn't trust the system. They didn't trust AI. They didn't trust the model. They thought, I've studied 10, 15 years for this. Like, why is the model going to be better than me? And I think if you make it more transparent and accountable, you're going to make sure that the doctors also understand what they're working with, but that it also allows them to then make it clear to their patients how certain decisions have come to be. Because I've actually been on the other side where I went with my mom who did have cancer to a doctor who then said, oh, like we're going to let a computer decide what kind of treatment you're going to get. And she just went out of that meeting and she was just like, why is the computer going to decide this like most important thing in my life? I want to know what is going on and I want to know why we're doing it. And I don't want some computer to just do this for me. So there I also noticed that if you want to make sure that we can adopt it from both sides, we do need to make sure that we understand what is happening.
Oh my gosh, wow. That's like, thanks for sharing that story. And I feel like it's definitely true that we know people have expertise, and like someone who's a doctor definitely has a ton of knowledge and a lot of them a ton of experience in seeing this. But it doesn't mean that you can't, use a tool that could they can look at it and make an assessment based on that. Like if they think it looks weird for some reason, you can go back and check. But if it's gonna, ultimately be more consistent than, a person making that decision, then I feel like it's such a good idea to use that. But great point as well is that if you're telling a patient that, even me, you think people working in tech are like, oh yeah, sure, sounds good, but I'd be like, how does this even work? Like, how did you come to this conclusion? Yeah. So, and kind of on that note, when we're talking about responsible AI, there's obviously a various different skill sets coming in here. Like there's the technical side, there's kind of the social side of it as well. And just, we talk a lot about empathy. And I think that actually is really true in this scenario. So if you're talking to someone who's maybe in university or college right now and is hoping to get into machine learning, why do you think they should learn about responsible AI, I guess? And, do you have any recommendations for how they can go about learning?
Yeah, I think by now that at least the way that I currently see trends going, although everyone is always expecting a new AI winter to come again, but I think machine learning will be such a big part in everyone's lives, especially if you use social media and anything like Netflix or YouTube, it's there. So I even would go as far to say that first of all, everyone needs to understand the basics of machine learning. Like you understand the basics of math, you also need to understand the basics of machine learning. You don't need to be able to implement it, you don't need to be able to design it, but you do need to understand what it is, how it works, and how it can impact your life. And I think with that, a huge component is the responsible AI. And not only because exactly what you say, it's not just the technical people that have to decide how to govern it, but it's also, people working in the government or in the sales and marketing department that might want to implement it. But even indeed as a user, you want to make sensible decisions on, should you use WhatsApp or Spotify or anything like that. And you don't really know if you never learn anything about it. So I think knowledge is really key to make good decisions for our society.
Skiing or skating?
Oh my God, neither. I want to say skating maybe.
Okay, Heineken or Grolsch?
Heineken.
Okay. It's okay to refer to your plants as children.
Definitely.
Dogs are cuter than cats.
Also for sure.
And how many bikes is too many bikes?
Oh, there's not a thing as too many bikes. I think I currently have 3 of my own, and we have 6 in the shed, and we're 2 of us.
Oh my God, that's awesome.
Well, there you have it. That's our segment on hot takes. Often when we you first kind of learn about AI, it's kind of like, okay, what is AI? What is the difference between AI versus ML versus deep learning, like those kinds of things. And then eventually, usually it's like the last thing in a presentation or in a course or whatever, then it goes to like ethics of AI.
Mhm.
So in that regard, and maybe this is kind of a AI versus ML type scenario, but what would you say the differences or similarities are between like AI ethics versus responsible AI?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I would really, make a clear distinction between them. But I'm also very acceptive of like any definitions. So
Yeah.
even with like the whole AI ML discussion, I always go like, yeah, whatever you consider to be AI, I'm fine with. But yeah, with responsible AI, I kind of see it as more of how you would implement it from the technical side, maybe, if I would give a definition to it. And with like the AI ethics, then I see it more as an organizational thing too. Like whenever I think about AI ethics, I think about Google's AI ethics department and Microsoft AI ethics department, and just like how on like the high level you decide what your policy is going to be. And with responsible AI, I see it more for like the smaller projects. How are you going to then implement it, and how are you going to detect when something goes wrong, mitigate it, and like make sure that it gets fixed. But that's maybe just my definition or my interpretation of it.
That's an interesting way to think about it actually. Like on the, I guess, like I work a lot more on the like infrastructure side. And so a lot of times when we think about like the governance of an Azure environment, it's kind of like you think about, okay, what are your like policies and things that you need to adhere to as a whole company? And then the like Azure policy or whatever tool you're using, but like there are certain technical components that are going to help you put those in place in that environment. So maybe, so yeah, that's just what came to mind when you're explaining it like that. Of it's like you kind of need to have something overarching just as an organization outside of the technology, based on industry, based on your own company, whatever. And then this kind of idea of these different pillars of responsible AI are kind of the piece that can help you adhere to that across the organization. Even if someone's not necessarily sitting in on those like high level ethics conversations, they should be able to take that kind of responsible AI approach and
Yeah.
implement what you've already decided as a company. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I really like, at least here in the Netherlands, we used to have it. He just actually moved to a different company, but we used to have an ethics officer too. So someone you could also go to, and he was also coming from a law background, so that also helps just to know that you're not breaking any laws like GDPR or anything. But he was kind of our spokesperson who we would also could go to internally. Like if a customer would come to me with a question or a use case regarding, using AI that I would like, I mean, always, or not always, but most of the time it's in a gray area, right? So then you kind of feel like, okay, this could maybe be something that will tap too much in people's privacy, for example. But I don't really know. Like it's sometimes really hard to make a decision by yourself, and having an ethics officer or someone like that you can go to really helps also for your day-to-day job. Who's familiar with the policy, of course.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like it starts getting like a pretty big topic when you get to that level where you have the frame. I like that analogy, Sarah, you said with like Azure policy, but it's like you need a framework because you need to know you have to have some sort of guideline to follow. But then when it comes to actually implementing it, there can be a lot of gray area, and you probably like you're not going to make that decision by yourself. You're not. You need people with different kinds of expertise, like whether it's law, like sociology, all kinds of different things, all kinds of different people participate in that conversation. So
Yeah.
no, it's very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not always like you always hear the really extreme cases where it's black and white, where you really think like, okay, this really cannot happen. But often also people realize afterwards, because then some scandal happened. But at the moment, you're not really sure. Like it can be really vague because you're not really sure if they're allowed to use that data, if that really will breach someone's privacy or anything like that. Or yeah, for me at least, I had one or two cases where I doubted, and it was really hard to then just make a decision by myself. Also, just because then you had to reject someone's idea.
Yeah. It's funny, like exactly like you mentioned, we hear about these like super extreme cases, and I remember seeing a presentation where they pull up like, oh, look at this algorithm that some company designed, and look at this, it was deciding who was going to get like employees, or it was like some sort of unemployment benefits, and if someone was like lived in a certain neighborhood that was not, you know, a poor neighborhood, or if they were a woman, all of these kinds of like all of these very obvious things. It was like their algorithm basically was super biased towards all of that. And that's like, you look at that, you're like, obviously there's something wrong with this. But yeah, there are definitely other scenarios, and I can't think of any off the top of my head, and obviously you don't have to talk about the customer use cases, but I think in real life there's a lot more gray area than it is just like, oh, you know, this is good or bad. So that's where the framework comes back in. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, there has been like one case that wasn't me personally, but we had a huge scandal here with the Dutch government, where they turned out to, when they were giving welfare for people that mostly had kids, they turned out to kind of discriminate a little bit, just a little bit. So that came out, and in the end, even like the parliament resigned and everything. So it came out to be a huge thing. But this was like a process that had been happening for the last, so many years. So this has been going on. And their problem there also was that you have so many people that are working with the welfare system or within the welfare system, and maybe one or two people down the line realize that something is going wrong, but it was really hard for them to then to make sure that this problem would be fixed, because they didn't really have some kind of procedure of how you could alert that this wasn't going fairly, or there was something going wrong. So every time that someone would ring the bell, then people would just kind of not react to it because no one would assume responsibility. And I think that happens without AI even being there. So if with AI, when we can make decisions even faster for more people more quickly, we need to make sure that we do have those procedures in place so that people also know where to go to, and that will, people will follow up on those kind of alerts to make sure that you really take care of it.
Yeah, for sure. When it's happening on a large scale, it's harder to track. If someone is currently a data scientist or an ML engineer or whatever various title that fits into that box, and they're not, they haven't really done a lot of ethics or responsible AI learning yet, what is the value of it for them specifically? And then I guess if there's any barriers, like what would you recommend for them to start learning about that for their careers?
Yeah, I think the reason why you would want to invest your time in responsible AI is also just to make your solution more future-proof. So we can make great models and we can, create great systems, but if it turns out that there is indeed some kind of bias in it, or it just doesn't work well, then it's not going to be used in the end anyway. And I know that there's already a lot that a data scientist has to take into consideration for it to be adopted. But yeah, I think a lot of the topics that we discuss in responsible AI are very useful also to to gain people's trust and to make sure it will be used, and that it will also be used for a longer period of time, no matter what might happen to legislation or anything like that. So I think, again, there's like two parts to it. I think it would be important to know what you can do with the tooling, like what is out there that can help you identify and mitigate any problems that might arise in your data. And at the other hand, I think it would also be very useful for data scientists, depending on the company you work with, but to take the lead in that discussion, to set up that policy of what you should allow or what you should allow your company to do regarding AI. Because I don't think anyone else will pick it up. And I think it has to unfortunately come from a data scientist, just because they are currently, experts on it. They know what's possible. They know what the limitations should be, even though you can probably go further than that. So I would say, like, not only learn about the tools, but also just learn a little bit about the ethical side behind it. And I think, we have a lot of online courses, like the AI Business School, I think is covered in there too, which I think is good, even if you're just, interested in AI in general, even as a data scientist, to understand, how should you approach it from a business perspective, and how should you kind of make sure that the company will take in AI on a wider scale.
I think I mean, it's come up, I think, a couple times now, but that bridge of like, yes, there are technical solutions, but at the end of the day, it's people that they're either are using the solution or it's affecting. And therefore, like, there needs to kind of be that bridge of the communication piece of how are we telling people about this. So I think it's a good
Yeah.
point that, like, even if you are going to be looking at it from a technical lens, to to take a bit of a detour and consume some of the more like business focused learning or whatever, it kind of gives you that like, oh, this is how I need to maybe explain this, or how I can communicate what's happening on the technical side.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's even the case without the responsibility topic. Like I was talking to a data scientist last week, and he also shared like that he would create like a fantastic model, created dashboards and everything, and then 3 months later he checks in and no one looked at his dashboard. So it's just really thinking about, who's your user, who's your end user, and how are they gonna take those insights and what are they gonna do with it.
This might be off topic, so we don't have to include it, but I'm kind of curious. I'm always curious about, like, right now, I think what we're talking about is you are building a machine learning solution. Perhaps it's a custom algorithm, but you're building it from scratch. But we also, and not just Microsoft, but a bunch of other big cloud companies have these like pre-built machine learning services. So ours are cognitive services.
Yeah.
I think Amazon is SageMaker, whatever, different names, like similar services. And I found, so I had this situation with a customer who wanted to use cognitive services for something, but they were asking for more information. Like how do I know what's going on? How do I know how this decision's being made? And it's like, well, that's kind of the drawback of using that. You don't get to know. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that aspect of, like, the pre-built machine learning services are awesome, but I find it is tough when we talk about explainability. You can't really explain to your, the CEO how this API made that decision because you didn't create it. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's I think it's a really interesting point, and it's like hits right on the nose. I mean, if you look at the cognitive services that we have, a lot of them are working with unstructured data such as text and video and images, meaning that we probably use deep learning models, which means that, even if we would publish those models, they wouldn't be like we couldn't really interpret them anyway, or probably interpret them, but not to the level at simpler models. So that's sort of like the upside of the downside. But I do agree, like, uh, the way the cognitive services work, unfortunately, is indeed that you don't really know what's happening in the background. And that's, of course, also just because it's intellectual property. They want to make sure that they can change the models underneath without having to constantly rewrite, everything. But yeah, it kind of goes against the transparency and the explainability. But from what I've seen, they do try to go more towards it so that you can export your models, for example, to actually kind of understand what is happening underneath. Unfortunately, you do need then, the technical expertise to interpret that. So it's not necessarily for business users that they would understand what's going on. But it's already a step in the right direction, I think. And at the same time, I mean, we're talking also about like responsible AI in some circumstances is definitely necessary and essential, but in some circumstances, I also don't think it really matters that much. So if it's just because you're, I don't know, creating like a database of images that you want to make searchable internally just so that, you can find the right image that you're looking for, then do we really need to make sure that we can explain exactly how we extracted information and tags from an image, So it's also just risk assessment and assessing the situation to see whether it's really necessary. And that's when I would say, then you can use cognitive services, but not in the case that you want to make a life and death decision.
Yeah, that's probably that's true, actually. And I totally agree. I remember with the customers that I mentioned, that's kind of the conclusion we came to, is like, you're using, in this case, it was text analytics, and it was for some internal assessment that they were doing. And really, I mean, if it's working, then great, continue to use it. And if you're looking at the results saying, this isn't really giving me any information, then don't use it. Like that's it. And ultimately, it was going to impact some business decisions, though. So that's why they were hesitant. But it's like, we just did kind of an initial assessment and then, went from there. But the other side of that is they didn't have any expertise to build something custom. So there are scenarios where you're kind of, I think, where customers can kind of get stuck, because what do you do in that case? You don't have the resources or the money to build something custom, but you don't want to use these pre-built services, and that it's about being able to explain them most of the time. So it's definitely a tricky, a sticky situation.
Yeah.
It's a tricky situation is what I was going to say.
Yeah, but I think that's, like, I find it a difficult topic like in general, because again, the good thing about those cognitive services is that anyone can use them, but at the same time, you do want to make sure, for example, if you're using custom vision, where we then can evaluate our model based on precision and recall, and sometimes you can tweak your model in certain ways. And if you really have like no idea of how the math behind it works, then you can still use it, but are you really using it responsibly? So it is definitely a downside, because especially with these newer technologies, on the one hand, they seem within everyone's reach, but everyone also is expected to know everything, so it becomes a bit of a problem. But I would also say that it's always good to have a little bit of an understanding of what you're using so that you can use it in a proper way. Because, like, again, I have a very statistical background, and even the simplest statistical techniques can be manipulated in such a way that they show what you want, but or can be used in a wrong way if you don't know how to tweak the calculations you're making. So yeah, I would say like always, unfortunately, you do need to have some kind of expertise in-house.